morning, everyone, at least to those that are joining us from the United States today. Good afternoon to those that may be joining us from Europe or other parts of the world. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. My name is Brian Selvey, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. Today's topic is What's New in GENESYS 2023, our latest release. Given the number of participants, I can see that this is going to be a topic of great interest. And with us today, we have an exceptional subject matter expert who many of you will recognize, one of our own at Vitech, Steve Cash. But before we meet our presenter, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I need to cover. First, we are recording this webinar for your reference later, and it'll be made available to everybody shortly thereafter the webinar concludes. Second, you'll see a control panel typically on the right side of your screen. You are muted by default, but we encourage you to ask questions. Please submit your questions in the questions window, and we will answer them during the presentation or during the Q&A session at the end. Lastly, we will ask 3 poll questions during the webinar, and we will share the results so you can see how others respond. Watch for the pop-up window when it's time for the polls. And with that, let's meet our presenter for today. Today, we are joined by Steve Cash. Steve is the Director of Customer Enablement at Vitech, where he's responsible for the development of systems engineering and product training materials for the team members and customers. Steve is a certified systems engineering professional through the International Council on Systems Engineering, or INCOSE. He spent 25+ years developing his systems engineering skills through experiential learning. While his experience is broad, he has spent the majority of his time in the automotive sector supporting the development of engine controls, transmission controls, suspension controls, and lithium-ion batteries. His roles over the years have ranged from electrical engineer to project lead to subject matter expert to manager. Steve holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Marquette University, and he's also a graduate of the INCOSE Institute for Technical Leadership. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for being here today, and let's go ahead and get started. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Steve, can you advance?
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. Steve's going to start out with a presentation, and then he's going to go into a demonstration of the new capabilities in GENESYS 2023 directly in the tool. So he'll go over product line changes, performance improvements, and a new capability called the Model Obfuscator. Do some demonstrations, and then finish with the other new capabilities: independent views, view lists, table views, and a new connector that we have to the SBE Vision digital thread platform. And then, of course, we'll leave some time for questions. Next slide. So with that, we have our first poll question. And with that, we'll go ahead and launch it. And you should now see the poll on your screen. Question is, which version of a Vitech product are you using now? So we'll start with our legacy product called Core, and then the last 3 versions of GENESYS. We'll leave this poll open for about a minute. All right, it's been a minute. I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So the results are here shown on the screen now. We've got almost 40% using GENESYS 2022, and 16% have now moved over to GENESYS 2023. Of course, if you are on older versions, and we do have a lot of people on the call that aren't using the GENESYS product now, and it looks like they're looking for more information about what we're doing. So, any comments or thoughts on the poll results, Steve?
Kind of. I think I'm a little surprised by the GENESYS 2023, as it's relatively recent. I'm glad to see it, and certainly that 39% or sorry 35% that are not using GENESYS products. We can have many more discussions beyond this if you have need for information about the product or demonstrations, but yeah, I'm glad to see all the participants there.
Great. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Steve, and thanks.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. As Brian indicated, I've broken the material up into kind of two pieces. One where I'm just going to present on some of the new features and capabilities in GENESYS, and then another where I'm actually going to be doing live demonstrations in GENESYS to show you these new features and capabilities. So I'm going to start with what has changed in our product line. So I'll start with just a basic understanding of what our products are, what are the different offerings. We have our GENESYS product, which is the primarily targeted at customer needs who need to create models, if you will. GENESYS Pro then is a product that adds additional capabilities onto the GENESYS product. It will handle the behavioral simulation and analytical tools. The Collaborate then is our GENESYS server, which then allows us to perform real-time collaboration across users. And then our fourth product is the GENESYS University Edition. And this is targeted for the educators, for the use of teaching model-based systems engineering, teaching systems engineering, and for research. So actually using it in their research facilities for development. So to kind of go through the product line changes, if you're familiar with Vitech and GENESYS products, we had two product offerings, the Collaborative Essentials and Collaborative Spectrum editions. Those two editions were set up primarily around view capabilities and supporting capability architectures. So Collaborative Essentials would require that users select whether I wanted to use traditional systems engineering views of information or SysML views, where the Spectrum edition didn't require you to select the type of views that were available to you. The Essentials edition also did not support mission capability architectures and DODAF reporting, where the Spectrum edition supported both of those features. That kind of configuration is going away. All products in the future will support all views, and all products will support capability architectures and DODAF reporting. That primary differentiator for the products is going to be around analytical capabilities. GENESYS is going to be for users that do not require that simulation or the analytical connectors. These are users that might focus on requirements, initial architecture concepts, verification, places where they don't really need to involve that simulation capability in GENESYS or the MATLAB Simulink and Model Center connectors. GENESYS Pro then takes the next step and gives you those additional analytical capabilities. So you have full access to simulation and the analytical connectors. Those are the primary differentiations between the two main products. On the collaboration front, things have changed a little bit, where in Collaborative Essentials and Collaborative Spectrum, you had some ability to collaborate locally on a local repository. In GENESYS and GENESYS Pro, that capability is not going to be there. You'll still have collaboration through file sharing, but to do real-time multi-user collaboration, you're going to be required to have a GENESYS server product. Now again, this reorganization of these capabilities is targeted at offering our customers different entry points into the product portfolio. Where you have a single user, where you have multi-users, whether you really need that analytical capability or not, they're different entry points. So the reconfiguration was targeted at addressing that. GENESYS server then, the base configuration used to be 10 universal connection licenses. We've upped that for the base configuration to 25 universal connection licenses so that you can have up to 25 users, but also as digital engineering becomes more of a mainstay for people, some of those connectors require then access to the database, and those universal connection license address those. We also then have added an additional offering of up to 100 universal connection licenses. And the last kind of change to our product portfolio is in the university edition. Previously, we used to limit the number of entities per class, which is 200 per class, and the total number of entities in the software was limited to 2,000, where now we can expand those capabilities out to 10,000 to support the activities at the university level as they get into their projects. A couple of different ways to get more information on product line changes and differences. You can go to our website, vitechcorp.com. There is a GENESYS version comparison page. Also, if you have any other questions about it, don't hesitate to send an email to info@vitechcorp.com. So that's the product line changes. What we've also seen is a big improvement in performance. We have established a set of bulk operations that will run, and we're doing tests against these to see how our product is performing with these bulk operations, trying to improve that performance, give you a better experience, be able to interact with the product better. So what we've seen is 76 to 98% reduction in these bulk operation test times. Now, these bulk operations, if I'm working within the tool, adding entities, moving things around in the organization of the tool, these are various tests that represent kind of normal operations that you would see users do. So the first one there, add 500 entities to a package. This is just reorganizing information, and it's essentially running through an operation 500 times, where before it used to take 563 seconds, it's now 38 seconds. So a significant reduction in overhead with performing operations. And as you go through all of these tests, be it drag drop or any others, we're seeing and tracking these performance improvements to offer you a better product. One of the new features that we have is called Model Obfuscator. And what this does is it allows you to export your project, but it basically masks all of the detailed data in the project while maintaining the project structure and the interrelationships of the information. This way, if there's a problem with your model, if there's issues, you can export it. We can analyze what's going on with it and help get back to you as to things that may be wrong, either in your model structure, or if there are truly issues within the database, we can start to look at those. But the Model Obfuscator gives you a way to export that project. And as you can see on the right-hand side here, all of the data gets masked so that there's no information being passed outside to us or to anybody else that might be looking at the model for various issues. Okay, so that's the slides that I have that I'm going to cover for presentation. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and escape out of slides and go to GENESYS. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with GENESYS, it might be a little hard to follow, and it's unfortunate. There's a lot to cover, a lot I can go through. I'm going to do the best I can, knowing that there are many of you who do not currently use GENESYS. I'm going to do my best. So don't hesitate to ask questions. And certainly, if we need to do follow-up, don't hesitate to send an email. We can do additional follow-ups as well. So here we are in GENESYS, and I have loaded the geospatial library sample problem. This is a sample problem that ships with the product. The data structure on the left-hand side is pretty typical if you're familiar with GENESYS. It's organized by the database, And there are kind of a couple of different ways to organize information. Packages is a standard methodology for organizing the data within a model. GENESYS primarily focuses on its facilities and the class structure in the way that it organizes information within the tool. We have added a new way of being able to organize and look at your information. It's called independent views. So this is where we have added additional features and capabilities. The primary objective of this independent views was kind of twofold. One, it gave us this way to organize sets of views. So not one or another view in particular, but to enable you to go throughout the model and pull a set of views together that represents things a certain way for a certain audience. The second aspect of it is then it becomes a place to store views that aren't directly tied to entities in the GENESYS model. Now, this might be a little bit confusing for those that aren't familiar with GENESYS. Pretty much any of the diagrams that we create are tied to an entity. The entity is the owner of a particular diagram. In some cases, much like table views, you're now talking about a representation of data that cross-cuts many different classes. There really is no owner of it. So we call those views entity-centric views that are tied to the classes. And we've now created this organization of those views that are cross-cutting the data model and become then independent views. I'm going to start with going through our views list and creating a set of view lists to show you, how you might organize things using the view lists data structure. So there are 4 primary types of view lists that you can use. There's the project pin, the user favorites, the filtered, and then the custom. So you can set these up to organize information. The project pinned organization is something that everybody who is working on the project would see. So you basically are saying, hey, this is a set of views that's important to the project team. We need to be aware of, we need to keep track of. The second one, user favorites, then is about you as an individual user. It might be an organization of what you're working on, but it's what's important to you. A filtered list you can create to sort through the various views that are out there and select those views. And then a custom list, then anybody could create one. Everybody can see these custom lists and you can add to them what is important for that particular view. So I'm going to start this by going to the project pin, and you can see in GENESYS that there is just a data pane here that allows you to look at the various views that are pinned for a project. Notice that there's an indication of pinned, an owning class, owning entity, a view name, a view type, and then who it was last modified by. You can adjust some of the data in that and what's displayed at the top by using the ellipsis button over here and add additional content. But for demonstrating this, I'm just going to go ahead and add some views. I click on the add, and this is just a dialog box to help us select and filter the views that we want to look at. In this case, I'm going to select the category entity. I'm going to select a particular folder, and in this case, it's going to be the component class folder. And I'm going to select a specific entity. And for the purposes of the pin list, I've selected the system context, which is our top level of our model. And if I apply that filter, it'll pull up all of the views that are available for the system context component. And in this case, you can see a number of different views, but I want to go ahead and add them. And I can do this in multiple ways. I can select, say, a BDD for the system context and select the pin. And you now see it showing up here in the list, or I can select multiples, so selecting the flow internal block and maybe the physical block diagram. I can select these with the control select and click OK, and it will pin them. And so you can create this custom list of pinned views that then anybody in the project would see. Now I only selected from the system context component, but you can select from any element within the model. I could easily go to another construct and add those. So users favorites is the same way. I'm going to take a different approach to adding these. If I go to the components and I go to my geospatial library, you can see how the views here, I have my Project Explorer, a browser view of the entities, and then the various property sheets. But all of my views are available down here at the bottom, and so I can simply select on them and look at those views of that particular entity. This is what we call entity-centric views, in that I'm looking at a particular entity of a particular class, and there is a view available for that. So this geospatial library, my top level of my BDD, and its components are available for view at the geospatial library level. I can simply come up here to the toolbar and select the favorites. It's now been added to my user favorites. I might also look at its physical block diagram and select it as a favorite, or select an activity diagram and select it as a favorite, or something like an IDEF0. So any one of the diagrams as you go through it can be added. So I go back to my user favorites. You can see that list available. A filtered list, then, I can create a new view list, and I just will call this all activity diagrams. Go ahead and click on that. It'll give me a data pane view along this lines. My scope, you have the name of the view, you have the scope of the view, you have the various classes, and you have the various types that you can add. We're going to go ahead and select the function class, and the diagram type that I'm going to look at is just the activity diagrams. And if I apply that to this filtered list, it will then capture and pull up all of the activity diagrams. And again, it will show me whether it's a pinned or a favorite, and I can adjust those here, so I could easily add one to the pin. But then it gives me the owning class, the owning entity, a view name, view type, last modified. The last type of list is a custom list, and you can create that. I just right-clicked on it, create a new custom view, a webinar view. And in this, much like the project bin and user favorites, I can select on the add views and use the same filters here to go and pull the various information out of the data. So if I select component as my class, let's actually select a different class. Let's look at the document class. Click OK, and we'll look at the source requirements documents. I can select any one of those, and then the diagram types that are available. In this case, there is a hierarchy. I can apply that. Oh, it doesn't exist. Try the requirements one, and I can select both of these documents and go ahead and add them to my webinar view favorites. And again, if I wanted to add them to pin or favorite, I could select it, but these are contained within my my list, my custom list for the webinar. Another way to add those would be to select a particular component, let's say the command center here, and I want to look at its activity diagram. I can come up here to a view list, and it shows me the lists and asks me which ones I wanted to add to. So I could add it to my webinar view and close, and it's now part of that list. If I go back to my webinar view, that function has been added. So there's a couple of different ways to add things to the various lists. So that's what we have on the various view lists. The next feature that we've added here is the table view. And I've already added a table for requirements, but essentially, when you use GENESYS, there is a meta chain search tool that we've been using in Excel for a long time to be able to query GENESYS, pull together tables. We've taken that meta chain query capability and moved it internal to GENESYS, and can now create tables in GENESYS that you can use to edit and modify information. So when you create a table, you would give it a name, group, and there are a number of definitions already established for these queries. In this case, I'm going to use the requirements group definition. Go ahead and click OK. And when I pull up that, well, there are no requirements groups in the data, so it didn't build out then any queries. Let me try a slightly different one. I'll do a functional table. Give a table definition, look at the functions, go ahead and click OK. And very quickly at the top level, it has pulled out that top level definition of the functionality. Now, if I wanted to modify the table definitions, we can modify them just like we would in Excel. You end up getting a meta chain development interface, and you could add the various properties, entities, relationships, relationship targets. Essentially, you're creating that query, that meta chain search using this dialog box. In this case, I'm going to add to my functions the relationship target of decomposed by, so any child functions. And I can set up my sort for numeric, and this would be function class. Go ahead and repeat data. Go ahead and click OK. And the table definition has been updated. So the child functions, I have the decomposed. I may have used the wrong definition there. Oh, described by, I want to decompose by. So I did indeed. And now you can see then the decomposition, my highest level functions are decomposed, and you have a functional decomposition throughout. Okay, so we have the ability then to create, modify, and add tables. All right, Brian, you want to trigger the next poll question?
Sure, let's go ahead and bring that up. So the next question should be on the screen now, and it is model organization a challenge for you? And pretty straightforward answers, yes, no, not applicable. And if there's any additional information you'd like to share, if you say yes or no, please feel free to share that in the chat if there's any additional context you'd like to provide. All right, we're just at about a minute and we've got most of those attending that who voted. So I will close the poll and share the results. So we've got 58% of attendees saying that yes, model organization is a challenge. Steve, any thoughts, retrospective sort of on those results?
Yeah, certainly. If I look at other than not applicable, you're talking about, right, 2/3 or more are struggling with model organization, and it is a challenge. There's no questions, and certainly GENESYS is set up to look at it as a class organization primarily, but it does support it with the packages and allowing you to define your own organization of information. And adding this view list then helps us to be able to organize it into quick access as well. We're going to continue to develop in the product additional ways that you can organize the information. But fundamentally, it's important that your organization talk about their models and how you want to organize them. It'll make it easier for teams of people to be able to organize information. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, certainly not. Thanks, Steve. So I'll go ahead and hide the poll and turn it back over to you again.
All right. So the last item that I'm going to demonstrate for you is our SBE Vision connector. And to do this, I'm actually going to open up two projects. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink this window down, and I'm going to open up a second project called architecture. It's basically the same project. What I have really done is I have transferred the data through the SBE Vision connector from one project to another. And the purpose in doing that is to demonstrate the capabilities of, hey, I have a digital threading tool, SBE Vision, and how does it take information, transform it to what it needs to do, and then transform it back into GENESYS. So you can get to see both transformations occurring. They're going to be somewhat innocuous because I'm not really transforming the information as part of this process. But if I'm working with other tools, Doors, JAMA, Jira, or any of the analytical tools, and we're working through the connector, our goal is to get data out of GENESYS and the right information to those tools on the other side of the digital engineering thread. Or conversely, working from another tool, being able to import that information from another tool. So I'm going to walk you through that process. And I'm really just going to take you into the tool, and under our utilities tab, there's the SBE digital thread tool. And I have to select, there's a couple of things you have to do to set this up in GENESYS. The first is you have to, and I'm going to cancel out of this, you have to import the SBE Vision schema extension. And essentially what this is doing is adding metadata to each of the entities in GENESYS so that it can track that information in the SBE tool. And it allows us to maintain then, if you will, a unique ID across tool chains managed by SBE. So that's the first thing that we need to do. Is any project we load, we'd add then this schema extension to capture that information. The second piece of the puzzle is to create what's called a viewpoint. And a viewpoint essentially is a set of filters, masks, mappings that structures your data or limits the view of data that's going to be communicated. In this case, I am communicating all of the model data. So my particular viewpoint is all entities. I have added no filters, no masks or mappings, because I want all of the information to be available to SBE Vision. you could add then filters, masks, and maps to limit the content that gets published from GENESYS to SBE Vision. So if I go back then to the digital thread tool, I select that particular viewpoint, and I'm going to include any context entities here, so anything that's related to my viewpoint, but not directly part of my viewpoint. That way I can keep the relationships available. I have to log in to SBE, and there's some connection settings here that define the data source, which is a particular configuration of data, and our host server. Go ahead and connect to that, and we'll see the next button. At this point, we have the options to import or export, and I would say export. I have to select a partition. Now, this is setup that occurs in the SBE tool, is that first and foremost, you establish a repository of information in their tool called a partition, and it's related to your tool, your project. And in this case, I created a partition very specifically called Webinar Demo Source. And then you can have multiple branches. Now, the branches you see here, the master branch is where I'm storing the data. Those other two branches are created as part of SBE Vision to manage what we call subscriptions. So these are copies of the master that the subscriptions use to pull data from GENESYS. So if I'm on the other side of a thread, I use a subscription to a source so that I can pull the latest and greatest data. This is publishing data to the master branch, and then I would have a channel, all entities. This is what establishes essentially that viewpoint, that connection between the viewpoint and that data repository. It is a channel of information, a set of entities targeted for this particular export function. Now in the export, we do not use subscriptions. Subscriptions are used on the import side. So I publish, I do my changes, I modify what I need to, I publish them. On the other side, somebody would then retrieve that information. Now, I've gone through the setup, but I haven't created any changes. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this particular export. And I'm going to come into my requirements, and I'm going to create a new requirement. And I'm going to call it system voltage. I create that new requirement. I'm going to give it a number, R.2.8, to fit within my requirement structure. I'm going to give it a simple description. The system shall be powered by 120 volts AC. So I can go ahead and set up a requirement. I can give it a type. In this case, it's a constraint. We'll say this is a design decision that we've made. It didn't come right out of a particular set of requirements. It was a decision that we made as the systems engineering team. I then am going to do a quick relationship of this to my overall category here of specify requirements. Oops, come on. And it's a refinement of that. It's just a hierarchical relationship, that specific requirements group. I've added it. So there's some things that have changed in the data. I now want to publish these to the SBE digital thread. I select the all entities, go ahead and connect. I'm going to do the export, my source, master branch, that channel 68, all entities. Go ahead and attach that, click next. I'm going to do the full project export. And so it's going through and figuring out the publication, waiting for it to finish. And it comes back and indicates I've gone through, verified, exported everything. Now it's been completed. The next step in this project, and I've got to go to the SBE Vision tool to run this. Essentially, I go to the GENESYS source, but that channel 68 shows up here, and it has a subscription associated with it. And what I want to do is take that master branch and the subscription branch and make sure that they are in sync. Now this allows then someone to play that configuration, change management, diff merge management outside of GENESYS. And so that webinar demo source was my partition. My master branch is my source. In this case, my target branch, I know this is 921. And essentially it shows me then the diffs. So the difference is I need to create system voltage. I can accept those diffs and submit and apply those changes. Once I've done that, now the subscription service on the other side is able to pull that information in. Now to show that, I'm going to go to my other project here, what I called my architecture. And if I look at the requirements, we'll find there is no 2.8 here. Now the structure is slightly different, and that's because right now folder structures are not being transferred through the connector. That will be a feature that's added, but the additional requirement doesn't show up yet. I'm going to go to that SBE digital thread on the other side. And again, I have created the all entities viewpoint. I can log in. Next, I'm going to select the import. And in this case, the partition is no longer my source, it is my destination. I'm treating these as two different tools. And so each partition represents a different tool. The branch again is master, my channel is 70, and the subscription is that 921 subscription, which is what I have set up to do the transfer. I can attach it, click next. So it's going to go through and look at all the information and show me essentially what the viewpoint has selected to be able to import. It takes just a minute to go pull that information. Oh, there we go. And then I'll go ahead and run the import. Again, it's going through, it's looking at all of the entities internally, it's looking at all the relationships, it's pulling that information and restructuring, rebuilding the project based on what's in SBE Vision. And as you can see then, comes back with a summary, basically imported one additional relationship. And that system voltage requirement now appears in my destination data. That seems like a lot to simply transfer one requirement from one project to another. This may not be the typical thing from GENESYS to GENESYS, but as you're working across tool chains and across an enterprise, those steps, I might be working in GENESYS, I do my publication, or I might be working in GENESYS and saying, hey, I got to check to see if there's any publications from any of the other tools. So that process is not slow. It takes a little bit of time to go out and see what information I need to import from what tools. So, all right. Let's go to our last poll question, Ryan.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. So we'll launch the last one, which is based on everything that you've seen now from Steve. Do you feel that these new features and enhancements in GENESYS 2023 will bring you value? We'll leave this open for about a minute. And if you have any comments on this, as far as yes, no, and why, please feel free to add those to the chat. All that feedback is very useful to us. All right, I'll go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So we've got 79% that have said yes, 3% that have said no, and 18% that have said not applicable. Again, if there's any feedback on specifically what you like or don't like, please share that with us in the chat. We use all of that to help update our roadmap and refine it and help with future improvements. But based on those results, Steve, any feedback or insights?
I'm no much like you. I'm an engineer. I focus on that 3%. Unfortunately, like to hear what isn't working as much as what's working. So,
absolutely. All right, I'll hide the poll and back over to you, Steve.
So the takeaways here is we've got a new product line offering, right? There's new versions targeted to better fit a diverse user group while still maintaining the collaborative capabilities across the GENESYS server. We've got a mindset of continuous improvement, and this has produced a significant step forward in providing a product that delivers higher performance. So those performance improvements are huge. And we've brought forward some new model organization and additional views of information, bringing flexibility to the modeler while also continuing to build the underpinning support for a full digital engineering ecosystem. So those are the takeaways. Let's go ahead and if you want, Zoom slideshow. Questions. Let's go to questions.
Great, and there have been a lot of questions that have been submitted. So thanks to all of our attendees for submitting questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get through them all. So I've actually already tried to respond to a few in the question chat that were quite straightforward, but we'll jump into the rest. So Steve, the first question that we should jump into that I'm looking at here is there's one about, is there any chance of independent views getting out of sync with the database? And the follow-up there is, any consistency issues introduced with SysML modeling tools?
So getting out of sync with the database, no. And the reason being is because everything in GENESYS, be it a table, a diagram, or whatever it may be, is always going back to the data that underpins the model and draws from that to create the views. So you're not creating necessarily views of data, you're creating a model, and the diagrams and tables are views of that data. So they're not independent. In GENESYS, they're intertwined. Similarly with the tables, you've created essentially a query into the data model. And so as you have the table, it is always querying the model and updating based on the query.
Yep, absolutely. And just to sort of tack that is, oh, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No, go ahead, man.
I was going to say, yeah, sort of, it's a different philosophy than some of the other tools. Many of the other SysML centric tools it's a diagram first mentality where you develop a diagram. Of course, the tool will create the elements and entities behind the scenes. If you add more data elements to the model, they don't necessarily show up on the diagram. So you obviously can get out of sync. There's ways to force the synchronization later, but you can't guarantee that they're in sync at any time. And as Steve is saying, GENESYS takes a different approach, and Vitech in general takes a different approach, where it's data first, right? So as he was saying, all the diagrams basically come for free. They're auto-generated by GENESYS based on the underlying data model. So they are always in sync. Sorry, Steve, back to you if you wanted to add anything else on that one.
Yeah, no, I wanted to try to address the second question there. Is there any chance, any consistency issues introduced as with system model? Okay, so no, yeah, the idea is that the consistency is maintained in the data model first, and the views are then representations of that data model. So really the inconsistency doesn't exist the way it does in other tools in GENESYS. So, okay.
Great,
Next
thanks.
question.
Yeah, so the next one is, how will GENESYS change for SysML? Not sure if there was a little bit more behind the scenes there, but maybe could you talk about how GENESYS deals with SysML today and what the future plans are?
Yeah, so GENESYS predecessor core is based on what's called our comprehensive systems definition language. You can think of this as like a SysML profile. It's a level higher than the details of SysML. But fundamentally, I'm using that profile and creating then the SysML views, BDD, IBD, activity diagrams, package diagrams, state diagrams, etc., from the data in that comprehensive system design language. So that's the foundation in GENESYS. Now, as we move forward, we are looking at the specifics of SysML v2 and how do we maintain the strengths and the values of our comprehensive system design language while still looking at the requirements and what's needed to be fully supportive of SysML v2. So we are looking at those differences and trying to figure out the strategy a little bit as to how we're going to change our reference model a little bit, but we want to maintain the power of our comprehensive system design language.
Great, thanks, Steve. So there's a question on the table views, and the question is, can you do multi-step meta chain navigations in custom table views?
Yes. So let's say I want to start with requirements. The requirements then, what am I traced to? Is it a physical component? Is it a functional? Is it traced then to verification? I can build off of a starting point, whatever my data set is, and it can be multiple classes, it doesn't have to be one, but I can create a set of data and start tracing from that data through the relationships in the data model to pull additional information. Not only what are the entities, but any of their attributes or relationship attributes or parameters associated with it. So you can build out a full table using the meta chain connections to build out as many columns as you want of data within a table view.
Great, thanks, Steve. So another question here is about using these table views and view lists in other ways. So is there a report builder that will be a way to find these in the report builder, will there be a way to find these view lists and table views?
Well, I know within the report writer pardon me, today, you can build the same meta chain analysis in the report writer to generate the table views. I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and look. Do we actually use the same table definitions, or do we have to create them uniquely? So yeah, I'll have to get that answer for you.
So that is on the roadmap as an enhancement. Right now, they're not incorporated in the same way that you see them in the table view definition generator today, but certainly something that we're working on as an enhancement.
And certainly the view list is something we need to add to the report writer to be able to pull that data. We may have the API to be able to do it with scripting. I have to investigate that.
Yeah. So there are a lot of other great questions here, and again, I'd like to thank everybody for submitting these. We're not going to be able to get to them all. We will we'll look through these and try to respond to them offline via email after the webinar. And again, thank you for all this feedback. But we'll have to spend the last couple minutes here just to wrap up the webinar. So Steve, if you could go to the next slide.
So LinkedIn profile, don't hesitate to reach out, connect. Any questions you can submit, support through me. You can submit then through email at Vitech, steve.cash@vitechcorp.com, info@vitechcorp.com. So if there's anything, any questions you have, for those of you who maybe don't have access to GENESYS, want to see more of GENESYS, we can certainly make those connections and go through some demos for you. So reach out. Happy to help. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Great, thanks, Steve. And to close out, I'd like to just mention that this is part of our Zuken 2023 technical webinar series. We do have a number of these technical webinars scheduled and on the docket for future months. The next one is going to be entitled A Systems Architecture and Modeling Challenge, Recap from the First Annual World Championships. So as some of you may know, at the last conference that we had, Integrate 23, we introduced the World Championships of Systems Architecting and Modeling. And this next webinar will be all about sort of a recap of what that whole experience was like. You'll get to hear a bit more about the problem statement, get to hear from one of the participants that won one of the awards, and from a judge. That will be on September 20th. Please take a moment to let us know how we did on today's webinar. There will be a 1-question exit survey, and we really appreciate your feedback. That helps us make these better going forward. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.